Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for the GCMA members meeting. We're very honoured and privileged to have Mr. Kevin Fish with us today, and Mr. Bob Williams, or the CEO of the GCMA. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Bob to introduce Kevin for everyone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third members meeting. For those of you who managed to get in the last couple of times, we started off with Jim Croxton, which is really interesting, talking about essential workers. Last week we were with Rob Maxfield and Joe Kelly from the PGA, and talking about the issues that PGA pros are having at the moment. So this week we've actually asked Kevin to join us. Kevin's a good friend of the association. We've known each other for a long time. Many of you will have seen Kevin at the conference back in November up at Cotswold Water Park. So just to give you a little bit of background, Kevin was the very first manager of the year for the GCMA back in 2004. After that, he spent 10 years in the industry as a club manager. And since then, he's been in the industry for now 20 years. So Kevin's got a wealth of experience. And we thought we'd just bring him along and talk a bit about, the poll results that he's been doing on the lockdown that's going on in our world at the moment. And then talk a little bit more about, when we evolve from this and when we come out the other side, we'll talk about the future as well. Now on your screen, you will see that he's called Jack Fish. I'm not saying anything about that. So if he wants to mention that, I'll let Kevin talk about that. But I think with no further ado, over to you, Jack. Kevin.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Gavin. Just to confirm, can you hear me out there, Gavin? Give me a nod.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay. The reason that I've got my name down as Jack Fish, ladies and gentlemen, is just simply because my laptop has developed an intermittent problem on its sound. So I've borrowed one of my 4 children's laptops. I've also kicked all 4 of them out of the house along with the 3 dogs, so that A, we have some broadband width, and B, we don't have any incidents like that poor BBC present. So what are we here to talk about? As Bob's brilliantly teed up, you've had the immediate advice that you needed from BGA, and in Jim Croxton, we've got someone who's providing first class, almost presidential style leadership for the greenkeepers. You've then heard from the PGA. It's now the time to talk about your role. And today really is about 2 things. It's about obtaining the data that we've taken from a poll that's been running for about 2 weeks now, just to tell you how other managers, other leaders like you have been handling the crisis, what they've done with their staff, how are they sensing the marketplace. And then perhaps more importantly, as we come out of this first phase of the crisis, what is your role? What have you got to do? What are some of the lessons we've learned from previous times when the country's been in crisis, and what impact did that have on our industry? So what I'm going to do first of all is just reveal the results of the poll. I'm going to be reading from a document here, and that document will be circulated to anyone who wants to email me. I can do that this evening. I believe that Bob and Gavin are going to arrange to email that as well to everyone on this call, everyone who's a GCMA member. And I know GCMA have opened the doors today as well for people who are not GCMA members. So if you're not, how about dropping them a line and finding out what the cost of joining is? I think that would be the smart thing to do for all of us together right now. So I'm going to be reading from this, and Gavin's going to be putting a couple of slides up. The poll went out 2 weeks ago, and within 24 hours, we had 54 people respond. So we knew that there was some appetite out there for some information. Bob's then very kindly circulated that to all the GCMA members, and we're now up to well over 120. I had to put the pen down on this yesterday, but we've already had another 20 responses. So there's clearly an appetite for more of this information. Let me give you some of the results. Gavin, if you want to put the first slide up, I don't believe that it's up yet. Great, so you should have a slide, which is just basically the introduction there so far. And if we can move through to the next slide, please, Gavin. Next slide, Gavin. So the next slide should simply have my email address on, should anybody want to get in touch. Now, the first question we asked was, are club managers, general managers, club secretaries, still working at this time? And as you'll see from the information that hopefully Gavin's putting up on the screen now, a huge 81% of club managers are still continuing to work as normal. Now, I say as normal, they're obviously working from home, with a further 4% still working, but on some sort of reduced hours. That means the remaining people are either furloughed. Furloughed at 80% of pay would be 10% of managers, and furloughed at 80% plus a further 20 from the club, that's a further 4%. Gavin, can you just confirm that the Zoom is working with the power? Aha, it looks like it is now. Can you give me a nod, Gavin? Just let me know that that is up on the screen. Great, okay. So as you'll see from the data there, most managers at clubs are still working as normal. I want you just to briefly pop down to the one at the bottom there. We've had our first casualty in the industry. We have had someone who's been made redundant as a result of this, and we're going to return to that before the end of today's workshop. What you could describe is going on so far in this first phase. The government have been the first people on the scene of this particular accident. They are the first responders, and the first aid that they've administered is basically through the furlough system. So if we look at the other admin staff at the club, what we'll find there, if Gavin pops that up on the screen, is that 37% of admin staff at clubs are still working, with a further 5 working reduced hours. Now that figure is dropping. It is dropping. When we did this a week ago, it was 6% higher. So clearly now what we're finding is that some clubs are starting to let their admin assistants stand back a little bit. Anecdotally, what we're finding is it's the larger clubs that are keeping the admin support staff on, and that's generally in order to help reorganize visitor bookings or event bookings. Next slide, please, Gavin.
Yeah, working on it.
Let's have a look at the food operation. As people who came to conference will know, we did an analysis of all the pressures on the industry and how people operate different systems. What we find is that more than 60% of people outsource their food to a franchisee, but for those who are doing it in-house, it won't come as any surprise to hear that only 6% who do it in-house are still working in the club. And what we found is that they are typically doing curbside deliveries or doing meals on wheels. I found an excellent example in John Maguire at Richmond Golf Club, whose turnover hasn't changed as a result of this. He's still just supporting the community with Meals on Wheels, for want of a better phrase. And I certainly know in America that is the norm as well. Most clubs are still offering some kind of service, albeit just not in-house. When it comes to furloughing people, almost a 50-50 split. 50% of those are furloughed at 80%, and 44 are chipping in the extra 20%. Turning to the next slide, Gavin, which would be the franchised food. As I say, over 60% of clubs in the UK outsource their food to a franchisee. That tends to be the clubs in the middle tier of the industry, the middle-sized clubs. And if ever I talk about different tiers of clubs, I base that on the size of the club based on their standard midweek green fee. It's probably the fairest way to evaluate the size of a club, because it's the price they charge when they would like to make some money. They don't necessarily charge the rate they think they're worth at the weekend, because they want to put that up. They keep the tea times for members. So we basically do this based on standard midweek green fee. If you're charging £36 or less, you'd be considered to be a small club. If you're charging £72 or more for a standard midweek summer green fee, then that's a large club. Everyone else is in the middle. And I just say that because most clubs who outsource their catering are in the middle tier. There are only 19 respondents who outsource their food and beverage and also pay a fee to those caterers. So this is the least robust of the statistics that we have. But of those 19, 37% are still paying the full franchise fee, 16% are paying a portion of it, and a huge 47% have stopped paying that fee. Now, what we've got to reflect on, and we'll come to this again later in the presentation, is the team that the club had in place going into the crisis there will be people at your club who are making decisions on what they want that team to look like at the end of the crisis. And a lot of the phone calls I'm getting, whether it's about food franchisees or whether it's about golf pros and their retainers, are asking how they should be handling this. I think the PGA handled it brilliantly last week by saying dialogue. Have some dialogue with these people. Turning to golf operations, those who run their golf shop in-house, not surprising, there's only 9% of clubs have still got their in-house golf shop operation working. And I guess some of those examples might be, as is happening with North Berwick, my own golf club that I'm a member at, they're organising a quiz where they just rely on the integrity of members, just like golf itself, to put in the answers, and they produce a top 10 list at the end of the week to tell you who's winning the quiz. So there's some activity going on in which the golf shop staff are keeping in touch with the members. And that's a good thing if we want to be able to retain their loyalty. Obviously, the vast majority are furloughed, and again, that's where the government have stepped in to help us in this early stage. If we turn to the more common use of a shop, that would be franchised, or what we might call a professional retainer. 67% have agreed to continue to pay the retainer as normal, but it's not the case everywhere. Again, I've had a lot of phone calls about that, and they're basically just, as PGA said last week, having some dialogue. I want to say at this stage that there are going to be those people who are reviewing right now in their homes whether or not they're really missing having their windows cleaned every month, or missing having their cleaner turn up, as we are desperately at the moment with 3 dogs in the house. But ultimately, the club is going to have some difficult decisions to make, and they will be asking themselves whether that team that they had going into the crisis is the team they want to have coming out of the crisis. And to a large degree, whether we're talking about the franchisee, whether we're talking about the pro, and I dare I say it, if we're talking about the general manager, they're going to be asking, is that the team we want to lead us out of this crisis? The PGA Pro is the director of first impressions at your club. If they are providing a great service, they're not going to be in any danger. If they're not providing a great service, don't be surprised if this is the moment when people approach you to ask what value you're getting from that arrangement. Over the page, we're on the golf course operation. Gavin, if you want to move on to golf course operations. Again, Jim Croxton, who I've shared this information with, was delighted to hear that 97% of clubs are now on reduced or essential course maintenance only. 3% have suspended things altogether. I've been on a few calls, Zoom calls around the globe in the last 2 weeks. I didn't realize that 2 US states and all of New Zealand golf clubs are banned from mowing their golf courses at all at the moment. So it's a brilliant thing that Jim's done in getting us permission to be able to maintain the course. And I live very close to 2 golf courses in North Berwick, and I can see the hardships these guys are putting in. That's only going to get more when the grass starts to grow even more. At the moment, the average number of staff per 18 holes that are maintaining those golf courses is 3.3. Again, Jim estimated it should be somewhere between 1 and 3. Well, it's actually 3.3 right now, so they're spreading the burden out a little bit wider. How are they handling the staff? In 19% of cases, as you can see, they're all working, and then it filters through to whether or not they're furloughed at 80% or throwing the extra 20% in, or indeed if it's just some of the staff in that position or all of the staff. So the data is there for you. You'll be drinking from the fire hose now, scribbling down data, I'm sure. But don't forget, folks, we will be emailing this to you so you can digest it and start to become the most informed person in the board. Next slide, please, Gavin. Now, one of the biggest questions that we asked, how many members are approaching their club now to query the membership subscription? 80% of a club's gross profit on average will come from membership subscriptions. So if you just imagine being sat in front of the Dragon's Den, they're going to be asking, are we looking after the members? Are we sure that that major source of profit is going to come back to us? And what we've learned there is that as many as 30% of your members are asking, at least asking the question, what can you do for me right now in terms of a membership deferral, if you like, a discount. some other kind of way of showing the fact that they're paying for 12 months but clearly aren't going to get 12 months. 30% was amongst the highest. There was a fair few number of managers reported that about a third are at least putting the phone call in. But the most common estimate is that 10% of members have picked up the phone to query their membership. Now, what I'd like to do there is turn that on its head and say that means that 90% of the members have not phoned up, have not challenged the value of their membership at this stage. Now, that might change with time, but it is at least starting to show us that people do value their membership subscription, and at this stage, they see themselves as being part of the solution. So hopefully that will continue. We then went on to ask the final question, which was around how we handle the requests that are coming in for sympathy towards the membership subscriptions. So Gavin will pull that up, and what we find is that for 67%, the answer is there is no alteration to existing payment policies, and that's the right approach in my view if we can hold on to that. I have to tell you that in the space of a week, that figure has come down by 15%. The first 54 people who responded, we were up at 82%, said, no, we're not giving way in any shape or form. Now, we've now jumped from 54 to 123 people in the survey, and that figure has come down. So what it shows is that people are nervous out there. They are trying to show a little bit of willing to keep people's support. And the manner in which they do that is then listed below. So you'll see there's a percentage who offer maybe some credit vouchers in the bar or in the pro shop. Some have even said that if we miss out on April this year, well, we'll give you April free next year. And some, of course, have just said, well, we'll take a 12th or a 10th off the subscription. What is interesting is that nobody yet has said there's a full refund available. Everyone's just waiting and seeing if things go back to normal, in inverted commas, sooner rather than later. So that's perhaps one of the more interesting statistics that come out of the poll so far. We've got one final slide, if Gavin can pull that up as well. Anticipated resignations. We are all going to have to start making decisions as to what is an essential purchase and a non-essential purchase in our lives. With 80% of a club's gross profit coming from this source, it would be wrong of us just to gloss over this. So we asked one more question, but before we talk about what the current outlook is, we need a benchmark, and that benchmark comes from the barometer report that are provided at the conference for GCMA in November. And what that revealed was that typical resignation rates in the UK at golf clubs is somewhere between 6 and 7%. Now, that does vary significantly according to the tier of club. Smaller clubs have a much higher resignation rate, the larger clubs a much lower one. But the average is 6 to 7%. And what we found is that when we asked the managers completing this poll to tell us what they estimate the number of resignations to be, I'm afraid we're up at 9 and almost 10%. Now, again, a week ago, from the first 54 people who completed this, we were actually at 5%. And therefore, that made my message a much more positive one, that our members are rallying behind us and they see the value of their membership, and under no circumstances are they giving it up. We are now starting to see a little trend up towards 9 or even 10%. Just to further complicate matters, looking a little bit deeper into those stats, although the general trend is up, only 1/3 of the managers who responded actually said that they expected more resignations than 6%. So those that are experiencing a higher figure than 6% are experiencing a significantly higher figure than 6%. But that means that 2/3 of the managers, the leaders, the people who are on this call have said that they don't expect this year to be any worse than previous years as things stand. Now, that concludes the results of the poll. Again, I stress you'll be getting all that information in a document if you want it. Either email me at kevin@ccl.services, you'll get that tonight, or indeed Bob and Gavin will arrange to put that all out tomorrow. Bob, I'll pause at that point and just ask if there's any questions coming through before we move on to the second part of today's workshop.
We can't hear Bob. I think if you just carry on with that, Kevin.
Oh, okay. Okay, Gavin, could you put up the next slide, please?
There we go.
There we go. Now, we're moving into the phase of this particular presentation, which talks about what the leaders can do. Sorry, Gavin, it looked very much like we lost the slide.
Bye.
Now, very sadly, at the weekend, we heard one of our personalities from the 70s and 80s, Tim Brooke-Taylor, died, very sadly. It was also interesting to note that they said that Tim Brooke-Taylor died not as a result of COVID, but he died with COVID. And the way we collect statistics is going to be very important for that. The reason I put that up is, firstly, I wanted to use a picture of a tandem. I'm not quite sure what a 3-seated tandem is. Someone can perhaps email in with that. But it's the fact that this was the first person reported who hasn't died as a result of it, but did die with it. This is basically an introduction to the fact that there will be some losses in the club industry this year. When we come out of this crisis, we are going to lose some clubs, in my opinion. But we're not losing them as a result of COVID, but we may be losing them with COVID. COVID could just be the final straw that breaks the back. Now, if we give a kind of context to the state of the industry right now, in the 20 years leading up to the millennium, there was a 20% increase in the number of golf holes built. And in the 21 years now, since the millennium, we've basically seen a 20% reduction in the number of people who want to buy that product. And if we were talking about any other product, if we were talking about pens, or if we're talking about glasses, laptops, if there were 20% more suppliers in the market and there were 20% fewer people willing to buy, there would be some businesses going out of business. And the definition of a business is, can you go out of business? Clubs are businesses, they can go out of business. And we are going to experience some pain, perhaps from the market correction that probably still needs to happen. Many clubs, certainly those in Scotland at the lower end, have been hanging on by their fingertips simply because club captains didn't want the club to go down on their watch. And I think what we're going to find is that for a lot of clubs, this is, if not the excuse, if that's too harsh a term to use, it could just be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. In the barometer report that we put out in November, we also looked at the pressures on the industry. I called it a barometer for that reason. Barometer measures those pressures. And already one of the stats we know is between 6 and 7% of people resign each year. That's a hell of a lot of people to replenish each year. Some other interesting data that paints a picture of where the industry is. The typical cash in hand for a club at that time was £200,000, which might seem very healthy. I wish I had that kind of money in the bank. But we said at the time, if we convert that into the number of months of overheads that you could continue to pay if the cash stopped coming in, at the time we said it would need to be some style of Lockerbie type disaster for that to happen. It's quite prophetic now that we've actually found ourselves in that situation. But on average, £200,000 equates to about 4 months of overheads. And a well-run business would have at least 6 months of overheads tucked away. Our industry doesn't have that. Now, 200,000 to one club is different to another. So to get a better context, you really need to benchmark that against an operating revenue. And what we found is that the typical cash in hand is 10% of operating revenue. Again, not a very healthy environment. What about debt? Well, debt, in my view, is really just around about commercial debt. Commercial debt is what you're due to pay for your leasing equipment that you're committed to the brewery, and to any bank loans. The typical debt at a club in the UK is £70,000, or again, to put it in more context, 10% of operating revenue. That works out around about £134 per member, per full member. Now, you'll all be frantically trying to work out what your position is. If you need some help with that, just email me. But the bottom line here is that 50% of the clubs are going to be lower than that figure, and 50% are going to be higher than that figure. The club industry wasn't in a great place before this crisis. Folks, I think we are going to have to really think about who's going to survive as a club at the end of it. To put one figure on a club's performance would be wrong. It's impossible to give a club one KPI that tells them whether they're performing well. But the nearest thing we've got is what you might say, what is left at the end of the day to reinvest into the business? What are the capital funds that are still available? As an industry, what we're actually finding is that the net worth of clubs is going backwards, not forwards. We, as the custodians of the club and the board members that you work for, are actually allowing the assets of the club to diminish to the tune of about £5,000 a year on average. Every club's going to be different, but what we're really saying is turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and we probably haven't been charging enough money to put it away, either to pay off debt, put it away for a rainy day, or indeed, more importantly, reinvest in the facilities to keep them attractive to the next generation who will keep the club going. So in very broad terms, what we're saying is, and it's not my quote, I wish it was, but when the tide goes out, you get to see who's been swimming naked. And a lot of people have been swimming naked, and we're about to find out. Gavin, could you go to the next slide, please? I've said already that 80% of your gross profit comes from subscriptions, and on average, about 16% comes from golf operations. Now, golf operations is predominantly visitor revenue, and coming from Scotland up here, particularly on the East Coast, many clubs, my own club, North Berwick, West Links included, can take an awful lot more than 16% of its profit from golf operations. And you may say, well, they're the lucky ones. They're only the lucky ones if they've kept that habit in check. Being able to bank revenue from visitors is what you might call a craving, which turns into a nasty habit. And rather than a drug dependency, some clubs now have a visitor dependency. If those clubs have been putting it away for a rainy day, and I know some have, my own club included, well, then they will be able to ride out this storm. But if those clubs have just been using that revenue to make the golf to the locals cheaper, and they haven't been squirreling some of the money away, they might be in more danger than even the clubs who rely more on members. Because we've no idea when the people who book to play golf will want to come back again. And what we're finding is at the moment, anecdotally, most people are saying, yes, just book us in for 6 months' time, book us in for the same time next year. We just don't know how long that will last. And I'm not the only person who thinks that maybe we've become a little bit reliant on that visitor revenue. Turning to the members, 80% of your gross profit comes from membership subscriptions. I think I've said that once or twice already, but what that should mean is that 80% of your time around the boardroom is spent on making sure that you continue to drive the engine through membership subscriptions. And in my experience, most clubs don't spend 80% of their time. We've really got a hearts and minds exercise to go on now. We've got to try and remind people that we are very different to the customers at the local gymnasium. Your members are more than customers. They are shareholders, they are stakeholders, they are custodians of the club. And if those members want their communities, their towns, their children to be able to benefit from the same benefits, and by that I mean the same standards and qualities that they have benefited from, then you simply have to tell them they must do whatever it takes to make sure that that club remains in existence and remains attractive to the next generation. Call them. Call them. I know that we're all coming to terms with what we've got to do with our time right now. My filing's never been as neat as you can probably see behind me. But the bottom line is, if I was a manager now, I'd be calling the most vulnerable people first, and I'd get the club diary out and I'd be calling people until I'd called 50 a day. And here we are in week 4. That would have been a hell of a lot of people I'd phoned by now. And then I'd phone them again. Because what we've got to try and make people realize is that they simply can't live without the golf club. The last crisis we had in 2008, David Ballantyne from the Dragon's Den, he said that he lost an awful lot of members at these gymnasiums. And he asked, you just put that down to the crisis? And he said, no, he sacked a lot of people because they failed to make their customers realize that they couldn't live without their gymnasium. And he asked the audience he was speaking to, he said, put your hand up if during the 2008 recession, you canceled your broadband subscription. Not a single hand in the room went up. And he said, that's because people now can't live without their broadband subscription. We're in a subscription business, and we have to get people to the point where they cannot live without their golf club membership. Now, you've got to do whatever you've got to do to get them to that point. You've got to test the strength of your membership engine, because that's what's going to see you through this problem. Food and beverage does not make a profit, folks. We know that. We've got the data. If you need to see it, just email me. But food and beverage does not make a profit in golf clubs. And the bigger the golf club, the more they tend to lose in food and beverage, because they can. It's an amenity. It's a source, not a source of profit. It's a source that people just put on their membership to make it taste better. So membership is essential, folks, absolutely essential. And the best example I can give you of it is a futurist who spoke at World Conference. And this futurist told us in no uncertain terms that the audience in front of him had prioritized career progression above family cohesion. Now, there was a little pause, as there is on this workshop, I'm sure, as people try to put that in context. We are now prioritizing career progression above family cohesion. He said, if you go back 2 generations, there is a good chance that your grandparents or great-grandparents chose their partner, their life partner, from a pool of about 20 people. That was certainly the case with my grandparents. He said, if you now look around you, what you'll find is that your children have no intention of living where you live. That's very true. I'm from 4, and my 3 siblings live in 4 different countries. Well, 4 including me. I have 4 children myself. I don't expect them to move into North Berwick. They couldn't afford it for a start, but hopefully one day they'll come back. But they'll go and further their career, something that 2 generations ago never happened. Now, at this stage, the audience, very much like this one, were wondering, why is this person telling us this? And he said, where do those older people go these days? They go to the golf club, and where they don't get the chance to pontificate in front of juniors anymore, they go into the golf club and they put their finger up and they wag their finger and they tell you how it used to be. They tell you how it was in the olden days. And they're using the golf club for that reason. But they also slowly realize that that golf club is the only people they have in their lives. And to put a not too fine a point on it, it's always a clumsy thing to say at this time, the members of your golf clubs are the ones who will go to each other's funerals. The family will fly in, but the family aren't close enough to be the influence they used to be. You have created somewhere for people to go to spend their time with an extended family that otherwise wouldn't exist. It's just possible that at this time people will lean on their clubs even more than they have. Cast your mind back to the 2 weeks just leading up to the lockdown. The tee sheets had never been fuller. And when we did lockdown, there was pandemonium. People were coming out with all sorts of excuses just to be able to see each other and be part of the club. Folks, there is hope out there. There is hope out there, but it's up to you to remind people how important that golf club is to you. Bob, I've got a little bit more to cover, but do you want me just to pause and ask if you've got any questions you want to ask so far? You're still muted, Bob.
Let me see if I can help Bob with that. There we go.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kevin, and thank you for that. And we'll let you continue in a short while. I'll just give you a quick break. I would just like to say that at the bottom of the page, if you hover the mouse, you'll see a chat button. Please feel free to put any questions you like into that box, and we can ask them then. Now, obviously, some of you will ask similar questions, bearing in mind we've got 230 people on this call today. So if you can just put those in the chat box as we're progressing, and then we'll do a consensus and we'll ask Kevin if he can expand on the points that you want to know about. But no, that's really interesting so far, Kevin, and over to you to continue, really.
Okay, Bob, thanks. Now then, Galvin, I'd like you to pull up the next slide, please, if you don't mind. Now, what's about to magically appear in front of you is one of the analogies I like to use. You're probably aware, anyone who's seen me speak, I like to use an analogy. And the best one I can give you is the three-legged stool. I'm not quite sure who invented the three-legged stool. It just doesn't make any sense to me, but we're stuck with it. And what you know about the three-legged stool is if you don't get each of the legs in proportion, then you start to slide off. And obviously, if you're sitting on there and there's a lot of trust that you are going to keep those three in proportion, that is the role of the leader of the club right there. What do those three legs represent? Well, the membership. We've already talked about the membership. They are the cornerstone of what you're about at the club. If the visitors disappeared tomorrow, we'd still have a club. We would certainly be spending a little bit more time loving our members than we do now. The second leg is the staff. We could give lots to the members, but if the staff can't cope, then it's not going to happen. The staff are absolutely crucial to the success of the club. Every one of the managers on this call knows it. And what you've got to do is you've got to make sure now, more than ever, that you show you're not the leader, you are their leader. You are their leader, and you are going to lead them through this crisis. I'm sure that you've all been in touch with the staff regularly. However often you're doing it, double it again. My wife is an absolute natural at this, and she is constantly on her way to the post office, posting things to the team, whether it's quizzes, Easter eggs, daft things to colour in, you name it. She is completely besotted with that team, and they know it, and she knows it. We've got to get to that stage. If you're not there now, you really, really must get to that stage. We've also said that there are going to be people who are going to be making decisions on the team that led you into this crisis. Do the board members want that to be the team that leads you out of this crisis? Now is a really good time to test the water with that team and keep in touch with them. And keep in touch with them using the 3 C's of communication, which are candor, courage, and consideration. Have the courage to have some difficult conversations. Have the candor to tell people exactly what you're thinking. Even if you don't have all the information, be honest about that, and have some consideration for where they are in their lives right now. Quite unsettled in many, many cases. We're generally pretty good at 2 of those 3 things. You're going to need to dial up in all 3, but stick with them and make sure that you look after the team. The third leg on that stool is the bottom line. Now, I've been using this analogy for years and years, and what we would do is we'd say, if you can keep these 3 things in balance, the members, the staff, and the bottom line, you've cracked it. There's going to be more pressure than ever on one of those things as we come out of this crisis, and that is going to be the bottom line. Now, what are we going to do? The first responders, the government have stopped the bleeding. We have been in a watching and waiting period. It generally takes the subconscious 3 weeks to catch up with a major event in our lives. This is as big an event that we've ever had in our lives. We've now got to come out of whatever frame of mind we're in and move into a more active frame of mind and be seen as the leaders to be leading the club forward. Gavin, could you put the next slide up, please? The next slide you've already seen before. We're back on Tim Brooke-Taylor again. I want you to have a look at this slide and tell me, which one of the 3 people are you right now? Now, I'd much rather be doing this in a classroom. I'm sure we all would. And we get a little bit more interaction about it. And, you know, we might be honest and say, well, I'm probably at the back. I'm probably actually slowing things down. I'm in the middle waiting for someone else to take control. There's only one person who's actually leading from the front here. Who's controlling the direction, the speed, the brakes, and the message? He's even got a message on the front of the bike for some reason. Save Peter. I have no idea who Peter is, but he's leading the message. Folks, I hope this is one of the analogies that stays with you, not just because we've lost Tim Brooke-Taylor this week, but I want you to sit on one of the seats on that bike. And I think by now you can probably work out which seat I want you to sit in. It's not the crisis that's going to cripple your club. It's how you respond to the crisis. And I fully understand if we are in this wait and see mode, but we now need to come out of there. I want you to lead by basing decisions on facts, not emotion. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation, we've already seen our first redundancy come out of this. I can guarantee that was a decision based on emotion, not on facts. If that club had phoned me, I would have been able to talk them down from the decision they took. They were not in a position where they needed to take that action. Now, there is a possibility that people sit there and say, I'm at a big club, I don't need to worry. Good for you, well done. That's possibly as a result of the hard work and the good financial management you've put in place, and you've found yourself at a big club that can survive that. For the vast majority of people on this call, that is not the case. And I need to tell you that as someone who lived through the 2008 crisis and lost their job at the time, clubs will take this time. They will take this opportunity to review who is leading the organization. I wasn't the only person to lose my job at the club at the time. Every department took a hit. But generally speaking, everyone who's on this call is on the highest salary. And you not only need to earn that now by stepping forward and getting on the front seat of the bike, but you also need to do it for your own sanity. Because if you end up just watching what's happening, it's no fun, believe me. We're all managing our clubs at the moment by remote control. We're not there, we don't have our fingers on it. Get your hands on the remote control, because if you don't, someone will change channel and you might not like what you're watching. Please do that. Please step forward and get on the front seat. Now, what choices are we going to have? If you sit down with your committee right now and you are coming from an informed position, what will happen is we'll say, where are we now? Where are we going? And how are we going to get there? If Gavin pulls up the next slide, it's a simple sat-nav. That's what a sat-nav tells you. Everyone thinks that the sat-nav tells you where to go. You've got to find out where you are first. You've got to say, here are the facts. I want you to be the most informed person in your boardroom, so that when you have a Zoom conference call with your board members, they're under no illusion as to who is the man or woman in the know. You know exactly where you are. You know exactly where you are in context with the industry. You've got some information from industry reports that tells you where we're going next. And you start working on some scenario planning where you triangulate between the financial facts of where you are, the assessment that you've made of your greatest revenue streams and how they will be affected, and the general state of the economy as to whether or not you believe there will be a small or a large hit on non-essential purchases. Now, that's just doing what a sat-nav does. Where are we now? Where are we going? And then how are we going to get there? There's two things that a committee will do if you don't step in and get on the front seat. The first one is to slash and hibernate. They will slash the head count, and then they will hibernate and hope it gets better. They will behave the way a hot air balloonist behaves when they're losing altitude. They will throw anything overboard to try and regain altitude. It's understandable, but it might not be necessary. What I want you to do is to have the facts at your fingertips. And I want you to recognize that the most important thing at the club is that the club stays there in 10 years, if it's a going concern. That might mean you have to take some action. That might mean that you have to take the staff with you. It might mean that you all have to suffer some form of pain to help the club through in the longer term, so that in 5 years, there is still a club there to employ local people, and there is still there a club that might employ a general manager. I want you to become the thermostat, not the thermometer. I told you I like analogies. The thermometer just takes the temperature. That's all we've been doing so far. The poll data just takes the temperature. It's time to be the thermostat and set the temperature, set the direction. And if you need to put this into a thought, we're all through our first 100 years at a club. Think about the time that someone writes the book for the 200-year anniversary. There'll be a chapter dedicated to COVID, and the board need to be reminded that their job is the strategy for the long term. And the president of the board right now will be judged in that 200-year centenary book on how they plotted the club's progress in that difficult period. Keep your board focused on strategy, keep them out of operations, but show them that you're in complete control of the facts and you know exactly where the club is going. That would be my advice to you. Gavin, I think we're close to the end there. We are indeed. Yeah. Folks,
okay,
in summary, Bob, if you don't mind, what I want to say is we're coming out of the first phase. We're coming out of the first phase where we've been watching and waiting. We've now got some data which helps you the most informed person in the board. And I now want you to start triangulating the data and taking it on the front seat of the tandem and taking it to the board so that they are under no illusion that you are the most informed person and that you are going to plot the club's future and make sure the chapter you write in that centenary book is a positive one for the club. Bob, I'll hand over to you at that stage.
Thanks, Kevin. I mean, when we looked at your presentation this morning, we saw Tim Brooke-Taylor on the front of the tandem. We thought, oh, I think you made a mistake there, but no, I can see where you're coming from now, and that's, like I say, a good analogy, and thanks for that. Although it did shake us up a little bit this morning. I've got a few questions, and I'm going to flip through these a little bit. This is from Anthony. I would also highly recommend that every manager implement a member engagement program by calling every member and ask them how they are doing. We have seen a 20% increase in member subs renewal speed. Everyone loves a phone call and to hear that you care. It also allows them to know you and know members really well. Smile and dial. If there's a message out there, what a great message that is. Smile and dial. Any thoughts?
I love it, Bob. What we generally talk about in the classroom is how much time do we dedicate this to paper, and for paper, read laptops, spreadsheets, and so forth, and how much do we dedicate to people? The managers who survive in this game are the ones who spend enough time around the people, and that's a combination of their members and their staff, so that in difficult times, they've built up enough deposits in the emotional bank account that they are the last to go. It's certainly a mistake I made in my career. I thought it was more important that we had all of the finances in order. I had some of the nicest laminating you've ever seen. But when it came to relationships with members, you know, I was lacking in that respect. I didn't see it as an important part of the job. I now would completely do it differently. And as much as you can do, I love dial and smile, as much as you can do of that will pay dividends. Not just now when we're in a crisis, but when things are back to normal, whatever we decide normal is. 100%, Bob. That's where the future of club management is going for those clubs who can afford it.
Richard Penley Martin has just chipped in. I've got the captains to talk to the members. They have little to do at the club at present. So it's another good way of doing it, I suppose. Alex Woodward, I know Alex. I've been calling members on their birthday and anniversary of membership. Members and committee have been massively appreciative and complimentary, all very much on the same theme. Steve Searle has asked, are there any types of grants available to a members club at the moment?
I'd need to pass on that one, Bob. I'm too far removed from the these days on a micro level. I've seen it more on a macro level these days. Maybe the guys at HQ would know better than me.
Yeah, I think we can look into that, and we can get Jim to have a look and come back to you. Dave has come through. Sometimes quite challenging to manage members' expectations. They want a course like Augusta. Bar prices as low as possible, food as low as possible, and of course membership as low as possible. So it's just a comment. Diane says, should contracts, I presume this is contracts of employment, now have force majeure statements?
Again, not my area of expertise.
No.
Refer that one to your legal staff. What I would say, Bob, is if you don't mind, members have always asked for everything at a cheap price. Whilst right now it's a positive that they are shareholders and owners and members and stakeholders and custodians, very, very few businesses are set up to succeed the way we are set up. And it's a rarity for the customers to be the owners, to be the decision makers, to be the biggest complainers. That's a very, very rare set of circumstances for a business to be set up. So we're never going to get members asking to pay more. They're always going to want more for less. But this is a great opportunity to show them our job as custodians is to set the club up on a much more robust footing than they have been, so that we can withstand this kind of thing. And people say, oh, it's a one-off. In the last 20 years, we've had 9/11, which wiped out all the visitor tourism in this part of the world, then foot and mouth, which wiped it out at the lower end. There was no travel there. A recession in 2008, which killed us again. And now this, that's a one every 5 years. Clubs need to be much more prudent about their finances. And that means the people who are paying have to pay a bit more. And the best analogy I can give you here is St. James's Park. At Newcastle in the 80s, I was paying £4, £4 to get in. And if they told me I'd be paying £25 2 years later, and all I get in return is a seat and a cleaner toilet, I would have said, not only am I not paying it, the 50,000 people behind me aren't paying it. Well, guess what? 2 years later, we were all paying it. So I think that golf's been far too cheap for far too long. Every single foreigner to this country will tell you that. And when I tell people, you know, it's £600 to play North Berwick, they assume that's per week. It's not. That's it for the year. So just maybe we have to take a leaf out of football's book and start charging a price that means we don't need to be as vulnerable in the future.
Yeah, very good, Kevin. Yeah, some great insights there. I'm getting a phone call from Bob, so I'm assuming that he's got some sort of a problem. So I'll continue on. There's a very, very pertinent question there from Graham. How do managers contact their members if they're currently furloughed? I'm sure that's quite a common case and quite a difficult one to answer, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I can't pretend that I'm a legal expert here, Gavin. All I would say is that I like the way the government have gone about their business in trying to protect the public. You know, we are in unprecedented times, and we're even at the stage where people are saying, look, if you laid someone off last month, it's okay just to go back. The company can take them back on, and it will keep them in a healthy position until this all resolves itself. I think it's an amazing statement and gesture from the government. Can we really then imagine a scenario where a furloughed manager would be taken to task for calling up on older members to see how they are? I just don't see that being one that ends up in court somehow.
Okay, yeah, I'm just looking for Bob at the moment to see if I can unmute him, which is one of the unfortunate things of the technology, and I can't actually see him at the moment.
What I can tell you, Gavin, just while you're talking, is someone's texted in to say that a three-seater tandem is a trandem. So there we go. We've learned something today. If nothing else, we've learned that it's a trandem.
That is correct. Yeah. So I'm just going to have to unmute everybody so as Bob can talk. So if
yeah, good. Hang on, let me just do. Turn on that GCMA
Okay,
call.
thanks very much, Gavin. Somebody has made a comment, but
gives me an excuse to get away from it because it's going round and
for
round.
staff to take photographs of their work, we email them to members in the video, clips from me, course manager, golf pro, and more. Darren Atwood, I'm still continue to email a weekly update to all members, and the feedback has been fantastic. Keeps them in the loop. If you're a company secretary, you're able to steer the business as appropriate, contacting members, etc. There was one I saw earlier on. Kevin, the survey that you've done, does that take into account the subscription renewal date? Ours were due on 1st of April. He's muted at the moment.
Yeah,
Gavin.
can we hear? Okay, sorry about that.
There we go. I think I'm unmuted now. I got that question literally 10 minutes before we came on today, Bob. The idea of all the polls I do are very much intended to be done in 5 minutes without too much depth to them, to give us a snapshot, a feel, and there's still enough to make us the most informed person in the boardroom. They don't take account of renewal dates, but what I am going to do, and Gavin, if you don't mind, if you've got a third hand there, if you could just pull up the last slide there about what happens next. Tomorrow I'll be issuing an email with another link to another survey, and what that will do is we'll start breaking down, just the next slide please Gav, it'll start breaking down the number of renewals according to the size of your club, because I want to give as much clarity as I can. It will also dive into what the levels of green fee losses are, so that we can start to get a feel for how some clubs are affected, to put it in context. So that's the next one that's coming out. And that slide that Gavin has just put up, it's just a reminder of my email if you want anything, whether it's this information or any other information. And secondly, because of the interest that this has provoked today, I'm quite happy to do a free 20-minute Zoom session next week, an evening one on Thursday and a one during the day on Friday, depending on the availability, not only of you, but with your chair. Now, as you might expect, we might have a slightly different agenda when we're talking about that with your chair in the room. But what we want to do is to provide clarity of thinking. The thing that we do best is to provide clarity of thinking and a clear way ahead. Now, it's free. If you want us to help you with that further, then obviously there's a charge attached to that. But for a 20-minute Zoom session, if anybody wants to take us up on that, just email me and we'll arrange that. If there's crazy demand, then maybe this becomes another GCMA session for Bob to consider in the coming weeks. But
Yeah.
if there are clubs out there who want to have that, I think you should have it with your chairman or chairwoman, and we can go through a couple of exercises that would just give you clarity of thinking as to what happens next and start the process of scenario planning.
There's a couple of interesting ones about furlough in here. Robert Holland from Torquay, I believe that furloughed staff can indeed do tasks that do not result in the business making a direct profit from their actions. Judy Barker has commented, that's correct about furloughed staff. We are using our furloughed bar staff to contact the most vulnerable members to check if they're okay. Phil Bonsall continues, sending 3 emails a week to members. It keeps a sense of belonging and community. Includes all sorts of things, updates, how staff are doing, members sharing recipes, quizzes, jokes, etc., etc. So there's a few more coming in along that line. There was one I saw earlier on, a couple the same, from Dave Spencer, this one. We have a percentage of our income from visitors. Any recommendations how we can reactivate that side of the business?
Not immediately, guys. The problem that we've got with visitor revenue is that for a lot of people, most visitor revenue is booked in advance. There's very little walk-on business that you might call it these days. So those people had holidays booked. They were relying on other people coming. May and September tend to be the guys on tour or the girls on tour. Out with that, it tends to be more still corporates and so on. But ultimately, if you can get them rebooked again, that's great. But I've already had, again, some anecdotal evidence from Gullen Golf Club, who said, although they are going to have to rebook the visitors, they've never experienced such demand from members for tea times. So in actual fact, they're having to make a decision. Are we really desperate for the income from the visitors, or are we desperate to satisfy our members? And you know, it doesn't need a business consultant for you to look at those books and say, where is our bread buttered? Do we need the money from the visitors, in which case we rebook them in, even if we have to give away some members' times? Or is our bread best buttered in the medium and longer term by dedicating those times to members? And that's an analysis that is club to club. It'll change from club to club. What I would also say is that quite a high proportion of visitor revenue is actually members' guests. So once the doors are open again, don't be surprised if you've seen a lot of people wanting to get the fresh air and have a game of golf, and members' guest rates might go through the roof for you. So that is a way of making up some of that lost revenue.
The final question is really a point which I'm not sure if is for you, Kevin, but an interesting one. When we are allowed to reopen the course, do you think there will be restrictions on activities, i.e. no open comps, limited numbers in societies, etc., etc.? I think we touched on this last week when we were with the PGA people, and we spoke about it recently in things like what's been happening in Denmark and in Jersey when they've reopened, where they've opened it up with a 1-ball playing or a 2-ball if it's from the same household, and many restrictions. I think that's probably what we're looking at. And we're sort of working with PGA and Big, and there's a letter going around at the moment, which is going to go to the RNA, talking about restrictions, which we would like the RNA to front up with the home unions as well. So there's those sort of things going on. Just a final question comes through. Could we ask how many clubs are still to send their subscription invoices? I don't know if we know that information, but my guess there are still a lot of clubs who work on May and June. I think the majority either do January or April. So it's an interesting time for all of us. I'm going to bring it to an end there and thank Kevin. I would also like to say to everybody that GCMA, as you know, has an information hub, which is updated almost daily. As much as we get everything come in, it's shared with everybody. Please look at that. If there are any of you on this today who are not GCMA members, we do have a 7-day trial offer going on at the moment, which is available from social media. Please feel free to log into that and contact us. We can give you access to the information that you want and show you really what GCMA is all about. We will be here next Wednesday. We will be here at 2 o'clock next Wednesday. At the moment, we are still working who our invited guest is going to be, but we will be here. Anything you want, please contact us. GCMA are not furloughed, and we are working 110% at the moment. So thank you very much for joining in. Many thanks to Kevin, and there's lots of messages coming through. Very good, thank you, safe, da-da-da-da-da. So thanks, Kev. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you all. We'll see you all next Wednesday, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Get on your bikes, everyone.
Tandem.
Get on your tandem.